In this very brief section, we're going to explore why firms exist, the theory of the firm. So the question, why do firms exist? Why don't entrepreneurs, after coming up with an idea, just go and produce on their own? You can think of the firm as an example of central planning, where you have the CEO and then you have managers underneath them carrying out the wish of the CEO, whoever is on top. Meanwhile, they're nestled within this free market where there's a lot of competition back and forth. So why don't we just have individuals, each one of them hire themselves out, and they do work piecemeal. They do some work for this purpose, some work for that purpose, and they send their finished products to different entrepreneurs who do something else in the process, and eventually it gets sold to consumers as a final good. Ronald Coase was particularly interested with this, and he applied his idea of transaction costs that we see in the Coase theorem and with externalities to why firms exist. So if the market is so efficient, why don't we just use it? Coase said the idea is transaction costs. There's a lot of costs that there are to just finding buyers and sellers. So it's difficult to find parties, to find the supplier to give you that good, then you do your labor to it and you try to sell to someone else. So to find that buyer and that seller can be time consuming and it can be expensive to write up a new contract. It can be very time consuming to try to actually write out the new contract. Maybe you need to hire a lawyer for that. So there's a lot of costs for individuals trying to operate entirely in the market without a firm structure. Therefore, we organize into firms to reduce these transaction costs. So employee contracts, these are usually long-term contracts or infinite contracts to reduce the renegotiation costs. Because there's costs of collecting information, how good is the employee, how often we're going to use them, how long do we want to make the contract. There's also costs of negotiating the contract, of actually sitting down, hammering out the details that both parties find agreeable. So instead of doing that every day or for every job the individual is going to do, oftentimes it's easier, most frequently it's easier to do it just one time for the individual and have them work for a very long time. So then firms, they're organized and they will rise when they can arrange to produce what they need internally. So instead of purchasing whatever resources or goods they want from outside vendors, they do that in-house. So other things being equal, a firm will tend to be larger if the lower the cost of organizing and the slower these costs rise with an increase in the transactions organized. So if there's a low cost, if it's not very difficult for firms to actually get organized in the beginning, firms will form. And then the slower these costs rise with an increase in the size of the firm or the number of transactions that firm needs to undertake to exist, firm will tend to be larger. Also, the less likely the entrepreneur is to make mistakes, and the smaller the increase in mistakes with an increase in the transactions organized. So the more likely it is that firm or the entrepreneurs themselves make mistakes with their business decisions, the more likely it is that they will be able to form a firm. Finally, the greater the lowering or the lower the rise in the supply price of factors of production to firms of larger size. So as a firm grows larger, either the price falls or the price rises less than the other costs of the firm rising to that size, of increasing to that size. What are the implications of Coase's theory of the firm? The first implication is that firms will grow to reduce the transaction costs. So they may engage in horizontal integration or vertical integration. Horizontal integration is buying competitors so they can increase the size of their production, they can sell to larger markets, they can produce more goods. And vertical integration is buying somewhere else along in the production process, another firm. So it can be buying the place that supplies you with the goods, so you end up making your components that you need for final production in-house. It could be buying the final retail outlet that actually sells your goods. It's adding another stage of the production and the selling process into your firm. So if it's very difficult, very costly for a firm to get their raw materials, they may, instead of trying to contract with firms or various other firms, they may just extract the raw materials themselves. Or if it's very difficult for, say, an auto manufacturer to try to sell to all these different auto dealers, they'll just open up their own auto dealer, and you can only buy then GMC cars from the GMC dealer. So that's vertical integration. And firms will do this until they will integrate either horizontally or vertically when it lowers costs for them. And this brings us to the second implication. Firms will stop growing once the transaction costs within the firm equal the transaction costs of going outside the firm. So when firms grow too large, they become bureaucratic. There's a lot of waste, there's a lot of managers, and the bureaucratic process, making sure you check all the boxes and you follow procedure perfectly, can add a lot of cost, add a lot of time. Because of that, it makes firms less efficient. So at some point, once a firm grows to too large of a size, it may be cheaper just to buy the supplies from someone else instead of manufacturing them in-house. So I used to work for a dorm furniture factory as my summer job when I was an undergrad, and they bought the wood and they bought the screws and the nails from other places. And then we would just basically, assemble them there in the factory. It was cheaper for them to just purchase those than to actually, make the nails themselves or make the screws themselves, to chop down the trees themselves. So because of that, the transaction cost of buying from someone else was lower than the cost of actually doing that themselves. And this is why we experience diseconomies of scale. Why firms, once they grow to a certain size, it becomes too expensive for them to operate efficiently, and they end up increasing their costs as they increase. So the final implication, and really the main reason why I wanted to talk about this, besides the fact that it actually uses the idea of economies of scale, is the fact that we will not have one company, one monopoly, ruling the world, so to speak. So if you watch BoJack Horseman in the later seasons, they make several jokes about this one company, and it's like a combination of like 20 of the biggest. It's like Apple, Amazon, GlaxoSmithKline, GE, Ford. And it's like 20 just enormous companies, and that's supposed to be the joke, that's where we're headed. That Amazon is going to control all the commerce in the world. But once Amazon reaches a certain point, they'll become inefficient. The economies of scale will stop increasing. They'll become too bloated, and at that point, they'll stop growing. Or if they grow to that size, they'll be like GE did a few years ago, and they'll start divesting other lines of their industry. So there's no need to worry about, one firm taking over everything, one firm growing to be the one monopoly that controls everything. Eventually, just economies of scale catch up with you, and the transaction costs of being a firm and producing and selling everything will be too high for the firm to do.